At first, I thought it was just a family argument, something that would blow over like they always do. But when I confronted my sister in front of everyone, the truth that came out left the entire room in stunned silence. It was the same every year. My parents' house bursting at the seams with family members, loud chatter echoing through the hallways, and the smell of roasting turkey wafting from the kitchen. The annual family gathering was as much a tradition as it was a test of patience. This year, nothing seemed different at first. My younger cousins ran wild, dodging through the adults who were either chasing them or catching up on gossip. The dining table groaned under the weight of homemade casseroles and desserts, while a heated debate about who was on dish duty brewed in the background. By mid-afternoon, the living room was alive with groans of frustration over a game of charades. But even amidst the chaos, I couldn't help but notice the strange energy surrounding my sister, Emily. Growing up, Emily was the perfect one. Straight A's, the star of every school event, the one who always knew exactly what to say to keep our parents happy. Meanwhile, I was the problemed child, the one who struggled to meet their expectations, the one who got compared to her at every turn. The years hadn't softened the dynamic between us. Even as adults, there was a tension that always seemed to bubble just below the surface. Emily never missed a chance to flaunt her success, and I never missed an opportunity to resent her for it. But this year, something was different. Emily wasn't her usual smug, polished self. She was almost overly nice. She offered to help Mom set the table, volunteered to do the dishes, and even went out of her way to laugh at Dad's terrible jokes, the same ones she usually rolled her eyes at. At first, I chalked it up to the holiday spirit. But the longer I watched her, the more her behavior felt forced, like she was trying to hide something. My suspicions deepened when I overheard her talking to our cousin Lisa. I had stepped into the hallway to grab a drink from the kitchen when their hushed voices caught my attention. "I can't let her find out," Emily whispered urgently. "It'll ruin everything." Lisa murmured something in response, but her voice was too low for me to catch the words. I froze, my hand tightening around my glass. Who was she talking about? What couldn't she let them find out? And why did it feel like she was talking about me? Emily and Lisa suddenly fell silent, and I realized they had spotted me lingering in the doorway. Lisa gave me a quick, nervous smile before slipping past me into the living room. Emily, on the other hand, acted like nothing had happened. "Hey," she said breezily, brushing past me. "You should try the apple pie. It's amazing this year." I watched her go, my chest tightening with unease. Emily had always been good at keeping up appearances, but this felt different. Forced. Desperate. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small talk, overreading, and board games. I tried to focus on the festivities, but my mind kept circling back to Emily's whispered words. Every time I glanced her way, she was either glued to her phone or whispering with Lisa, their heads bent close together. By the time dinner rolled around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. And whatever it was, it felt like it was only a matter of time before it came to light. As we all sat down at the long dining table, Emily raised her glass for a toast, flashing one of her perfect smiles. But I noticed her hand trembled slightly as she held her wine. "To family," she said, her voice just a little too cheerful. Everyone clinked glasses, laughing and talking over one another. But I couldn't bring myself to join in. I was too busy wondering what secrets my sister was so desperate to keep hidden, and what would happen if they finally came out. I didn't plan on becoming the family spy that day. Honestly, all I wanted was a refill on my drink and maybe 5 minutes of peace away from the chaos in the living room. But as I stepped into the hallway leading to the kitchen, I caught a snippet of conversation that made me stop dead in my tracks. "I can't let her find out. It'll ruin everything," Emily whispered, her tone urgent. I peeked around the corner to see her standing with Lisa, our cousin. Lisa was fidgeting nervously, glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to walk in at any moment. Her eyes briefly met mine before she quickly looked away, her face pale. "I don't know, Emily," Lisa said in a low voice. "Maybe you should just tell her. It's going to come out eventually." "Not now," Emily hissed, shaking her head. "Not like this." I stayed frozen in place, clutching my glass tightly as my mind raced. Who were they talking about? What couldn't Emily let her find out? And why did Lisa look like she wanted to melt into the floor the moment she spotted me? Before I could gather my thoughts, Lisa mumbled something I couldn't hear and walked away, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself invisible. Emily, on the other hand, took a deep breath and plastered on a smile as she turned in my direction. "Hey," she said brightly, her tone a little too casual. "Did you need something?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. Just grabbing a drink, I said, holding up my empty glass. What's going on with you and Lisa? Her smile faltered for a split second, so fast I almost missed it. Oh, nothing, she said with a laugh that sounded forced. Just catching up. You know how Lisa gets. She's always overthinking things. Right, I said, nodding slowly. But as I walked past her into the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. For the rest of the evening, Emily made a point of avoiding me. She sat on the opposite end of the table during dinner, her head tilted towards Dad as she laughed too loudly at his jokes. When we moved back to the living room for dessert, she busied herself passing out slices of pie and refilling drinks, always staying just out of reach. It was so unlike her. Normally, Emily relished the spotlight, always the center of attention with her quick wit and polished charm. But tonight, she seemed like a shadow of herself, darting from one group to another, never staying in one place for long. I tried to corner her after dessert, casually asking her what she and Lisa had been whispering about earlier. She waved me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You're imagining things, she said, her laugh high-pitched and shaky. We were just talking about her kids. You know how stressed she gets this time of year, right? I said again, trying to keep my tone neutral. But inside, I was boiling. I hated being brushed off, especially by Emily, and I hated even more how transparent her deflection was. As the night wound down, I couldn't stop replaying her words in my mind. I can't let her find out. It'll ruin everything. Who was her? Was it me? Mom? Someone else entirely? And what was Emily so desperate to hide that she was practically vibrating with anxiety every time I got near her? When I finally headed upstairs to the guest room for the night, I was no closer to answers than I'd been earlier in the hallway. All I knew was that something was going on, and Emily was determined to keep me, or someone, out of the loop. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as my mind cycled through possibilities. Was it about her job? Her marriage? Money? Emily's life always seemed so picture-perfect on the surface, but maybe it wasn't as flawless as she wanted everyone to believe. One thing was certain. I wasn't going to let this go. Whatever Emily was hiding, I was going to find out. The next morning started like every other morning of the family gathering, chaotic and loud. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and pancakes wafted through the house as kids darted between rooms, dodging adults who were either too groggy or too busy with breakfast preparations to care. It was pure madness, but somehow, Mom managed to keep everyone in line. By mid-morning, she had rallied the entire family for the annual tradition, the family photo. This was always her favorite part of the weekend, though the process itself was anything but smooth. The backyard became a battlefield of squabbling cousins, crying toddlers, and adults grumbling over who stood where. Emily, of course, managed to look perfectly composed, as if she'd stepped out of a magazine. While I was busy wrangling one of my younger cousins into the lineup, I caught a glimpse of her pulling Mom aside near the garden. They were just out of earshot, but Emily's body language spoke volumes. She leaned in close, speaking quickly, her hands gesturing slightly as if to emphasize her point. Mom's face shifted from cheerful to serious in a matter of seconds. Whatever Emily was saying, it wasn't casual. I pretended to focus on helping the kids settle down, but my eyes stayed locked on the two of them. Mom glanced in my direction, her lips pressed into a thin line, and nodded at something Emily said. The knot in my stomach tightened. What now? Emily returned to the group, her smile back in place like nothing had happened. She caught my gaze for a brief moment but looked away quickly, heading to the front of the group to secure her usual spot in the center. All right, everyone, let's hurry up before the light changes, Mom called out, clapping her hands. She had a way of making even the most stubborn members of the family comply, and soon enough, we were crammed together for the photo. The photographer counted down, snapping a series of pictures while everyone strained to keep smiling through the chaos. As soon as the session ended, the kids bolted for freedom, and the adults dispersed to resume their usual holiday chatter. But I wasn't ready to let it go. Emily's whispered conversation with Mom replayed in my head like a broken record. What was she telling her? And why had Mom glanced at me like that? I waited until the crowd had cleared, then followed Mom into the kitchen. She was busy organizing leftovers, her usual post-activity routine. Hey, Mom, I said, trying to sound casual. What was Emily talking to you about earlier? She froze for just a split second before resuming her task. Oh, nothing important, she said, her tone light. She just wanted to make sure the kids weren't causing too much trouble. I raised an eyebrow. She looked pretty serious for someone talking about the kids. Mom hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of a plastic container. "It's really nothing, honey," she said, finally meeting my eyes. But there was something in her expression, nervousness, maybe? Or guilt. Whatever it was, I wasn't buying it. "Mom," I pressed, stepping closer. "You're a terrible liar. Just tell me what she said." She sighed, shaking her head. "You're imagining things. Emily's just stressed about work, that's all." "Is she?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Because it seems like there's more to it than that. And you're acting like it's about me." Mom avoided my gaze, focusing intently on stacking the containers. "You're reading too much into it," she said, her voice tinged with finality. "Now, can you help me set up the coffee for everyone?" It was clear she wasn't going to give me anything, but her deflection only made me more certain that something was going on. Whatever Emily had whispered to her, it wasn't just about the kids, or work, or any of the excuses Mom was throwing at me. As I left the kitchen, my mind was spinning with possibilities. Emily was keeping a secret, that much was obvious. But now it seemed like Mom was in on it too, or at least knew enough to cover for her. What were they hiding? And why did it feel like I was at the center of it? One thing was clear. I wasn't going to get the answers by asking nicely. It was time to start digging. By the time lunch rolled around, the energy in the house had shifted. The morning's chaos had settled into a lazy lull, with the kids playing board games in the corner and the adults scattered between the living room and kitchen, nursing coffee or wine. Emily was back to her usual polished self, chatting animatedly with one of our aunts about some new project at work. But the tension from earlier still lingered beneath the surface. I could feel it every time Emily glanced my way, quick, darting looks before she turned her attention back to whoever she was talking to. I stayed quiet, watching her like a hawk and waiting for her perfect facade to crack. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. My younger brother Alex, who had been balancing a glass of wine on a stack of books, why, I'll never know, accidentally bumped into the coffee table. The glass tipped over, sending its deep red contents splashing across Emily's pristine white dress. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look. Alex's face turned red as he scrambled to grab a napkin, stammering out an apology. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I didn't mean to." But before he could finish, Emily exploded. "Are you kidding me, Alex?" she yelled, standing up so abruptly that her chair nearly tipped over. "Can you not go 5 minutes without ruining something?" Her voice was sharp and cutting, far louder than it needed to be for a simple accident. Alex froze, his eyes wide with shock, and I could see tears welling up as she continued berating him. "Do you have any idea how much this dress cost? Or how hard it is to get wine stains out of silk?" she demanded, her face flushed with anger. "Emily, it was an accident," Mom said gently, stepping in to defuse the situation. "Let's just—" "No, Mom," Emily snapped, cutting her off. "He's old enough to know better." The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Emily grabbed a towel and stormed out, muttering angrily under her breath. Alex looked like he was about to cry, and my dad quickly ushered him into the kitchen to calm him down. I sat there, stunned. Emily's reaction was so disproportionate, so completely out of character, that it left me reeling. Sure, she had always been a bit of a perfectionist, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't about the dress. I could see that clearly. No, this outburst had nothing to do with Alex or the spilled wine. This was about whatever she was hiding, whatever was weighing on her so heavily that even a small inconvenience was enough to make her snap. I glanced at Lisa, who was sitting across the room. She looked as shaken as I felt, her eyes fixed on the doorway Emily had disappeared through. When she noticed me watching her, she quickly looked away, fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. Emily didn't come back downstairs for almost an hour. When she finally did, she was wearing a different dress and acting like nothing had happened. "Sorry about that," she said breezily, flashing the room her signature smile. "I just needed a minute to cool off." The room relaxed slightly, though I noticed Alex still hadn't rejoined the group. Emily floated back into the conversation like she hadn't just screamed at a teenager over a spilled drink. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a performance. Her movements were too precise, her laugh a little too forced. I watched her closely for the rest of the afternoon, waiting for another crack in her facade. But Emily was careful, keeping herself busy with small talk and hovering near Mom whenever she could. By the time dinner rolled around, I'd made a decision. Whatever Emily was hiding, it was tearing her apart, and it was starting to affect the rest of us, too. I didn't know what her secret was yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her keep it buried. By the time dinner was over, the tension between Emily and me had become unbearable. She floated around the room, smiling and chatting as though nothing had happened, but I could see the strain in her eyes. Her earlier outbursts still lingered in the air, and no amount of polite conversation could erase it. I waited until we were all gathered in the living room. The kids sprawled out on the floor with their games while the adults relaxed with coffee and dessert. Emily was perched on the couch, scrolling through her phone with an air of forced calm. My heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I stood up, clearing my throat. "Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "is there something you want to share with the rest of us?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice tight. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my pulse racing. "I heard you talking to Lisa yesterday. You said you couldn't let me find out about something. What is it?" The room went dead silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Emily. Even the kids paused their game, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Emily's face flushed, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. But then she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you think you heard," she said, her tone sharp, "but you're making a scene over nothing." I wasn't about to let her brush me off this time. "Don't lie to me," I said, stepping closer. "You've been acting weird all weekend." Whispering to Lisa, pulling Mom aside, blowing up at Alex over a stupid accident. "What's going on, Emily? What are you hiding?" Her jaw tightened, and she stood up, her phone clutched in her hand. "You're being ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "There's nothing to hide. Maybe you're just jealous because I actually have my life together for once." That struck a nerve. Emily had always loved playing the perfect card, and I wasn't going to let her use it to deflect from the real issue. "Oh, give me a break," I shot back. "This isn't about me. It's about you, and whatever secret you're trying so hard to keep buried." Mom stepped in then, her voice firm but nervous. "All right, that's enough," she said, glancing between the two of us. "This is supposed to be a family gathering, not a fight." But I couldn't back down. "Not now." "If it's nothing, then just say it, Emily," I pressed. "Tell us what's going on." Emily glared at me, her eyes blazing with anger. For a moment, I thought she was going to yell, or maybe even storm out of the room. But then, to my surprise, she laughed. "You're unbelievable," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can't stand not being the center of attention, can you? So now you're making up drama to get everyone to look at you." Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay calm. "This isn't about attention," I said. "It's about the truth. And if you're not going to tell us, maybe Lisa will." Lisa, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. She started, but Emily cut her off. "Don't," Emily said sharply, turning to face her. "You don't need to say anything." That was all the confirmation I needed. Whatever Emily was hiding, Lisa knew about it, and she was scared to speak up. "Why not, Emily?" I said, my voice rising. "What are you so afraid of?" The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was staring at Emily, waiting for her to respond. Her hands were trembling, and her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain it to me," I said. "Because I'm done being in the dark." For a long moment, she just stood there, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her breathing. Then she turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding. The confrontation hadn't gone the way I'd hoped, but one thing was clear. Emily's secret was bigger than I'd imagined. And no matter what it took, I was going to find out the truth. When Emily finally came back downstairs, everyone was still in the living room, the air thick with tension. I was standing near the window, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She looked calm. Too calm, like someone who had spent the last hour rehearsing their lines. I let her settle back onto the couch, her phone in hand, before I made my move. "Emily," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of casual conversation, "we're not done?" The room went quiet, all eyes turning toward us again. Emily's head snapped up, her carefully maintained expression slipping for a fraction of a second before she plastered on a smile. "Not done with what?" she asked, feigning innocence. "Whatever it is you're hiding," I said, stepping forward. "You never answer my question. Why were you whispering to Lisa?" And what did you tell Mom before the photo? Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny everything again. But instead, she let out a high, nervous laugh. You're being ridiculous, she said, shaking her head. There's nothing to tell. Then why are you acting so weird? I pressed. Why did you blow up at Alex over a stupid accident? And why have you been avoiding me all weekend? Her composure cracked slightly, her fingers tightening around her phone. I'm not avoiding you, she said, her voice sharp. Maybe you're just imagining things. Or maybe you're trying to make this weekend about you, because you can't stand when things don't revolve around you. Her accusation stung, but I refused to back down. This isn't about me, Emily, I said firmly. It's about whatever secret you're keeping. You're acting like a cornered animal, and it's obvious to everyone in this room. She glared at me, her cheeks flushing even deeper. You're making a scene, she said through gritted teeth, her voice low enough that only I could hear. Maybe I am, I said, crossing my arms. But you're the one who's been acting shady all weekend. So if you don't want me to make a scene, then just tell us what's going on. Her hands shook slightly as she held her phone, her knuckles white. For the first time, I noticed how tightly she was gripping it, like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between us. Mom looked especially uncomfortable, her hands twisting in her lap as if she wanted to intervene but didn't know how. Lisa, who had been trying to make herself invisible in the corner, finally spoke up. Maybe we should all just take a breather, she said quietly. No, I said, my eyes still locked on Emily. We're not brushing this under the rug. Not this time. Emily's mask of confidence was slipping further with every passing second. Her jaw clenched, and I could see the muscles in her neck tighten as she tried to keep herself together. You really want to do this here? In front of everyone, she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Yes, I said without hesitation. Because whatever this is, it's affecting all of us. And I think we deserve to know the truth. She stared at me for a long moment, her chest rising and falling as if she was trying to steady her breathing. Then she laughed again, but this time it was bitter, almost angry. You think you're so clever, don't you? She said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Always digging, always looking for something to use against me. This isn't about using anything against you, I said calmly. It's about honesty. Something you've clearly forgotten how to practice. Her glare hardened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to storm out again. But then, to my surprise, she sank back onto the couch, her shoulders slumping slightly. Fine, she said, her voice quieter now. You want the truth? Be careful what you wish for. I braced myself, my heart pounding as I waited for her to continue. But instead of speaking, she turned to Lisa, her expression unreadable. Do you want to tell them, or should I? Lisa's face went pale, and she shook her head. Emily, don't. But Emily cut her off. No, it's too late for that. She wanted the truth, so she's going to get it. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Whatever she was about to say, I knew it was going to change everything. The air in the living room was heavy, charged with tension as Emily glared at me from across the room. She was still clutching her phone like a lifeline, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the battle raging behind her eyes. Deflect or explode. Deny or confess. I wasn't about to let her off the hook. We're waiting, Emily, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. What's the truth you're so desperate to hide? Her composure, already hanging by a thread, snapped. You don't even know what you're talking about, she shouted, standing up so abruptly that her phone slipped from her hands and landed on the couch. You think you're so clever, but you have no idea what I've done for this family. Her words rang out like a gunshot, and the room fell deathly silent. I could feel every pair of eyes turn toward her, wide with shock. Even the kids, who had been quietly playing in the corner, stopped what they were doing and looked up. Emily's face went pale, and I saw the panic flash across her features as she realized what she'd just said. She opened her mouth as if to take it back, but the damage was already done. What do you mean, what you've done for this family? I asked, my voice steady but low, cutting through the silence. Her jaw worked as if she was trying to come up with an excuse, but no words came. She shook her head, refusing to meet my eyes. Emily, Dad said, his tone serious. What are you talking about? She started, but then she clamped her mouth shut, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. It's nothing. Forget I said anything. But there was no way anyone was going to forget that. Mom leaned forward in her chair, her face tight with worry. "Emily, honey," she said gently, "if something's going on, you need to tell us." Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but she found none. Everyone was staring at her now, waiting for an explanation. Even Lisa, who had been trying to stay out of the spotlight, looked like she wanted to crawl into a hole. "I didn't mean it like that," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just upset. That's all." "You don't get to say something like that and then brush it off," I said, my frustration bubbling over. "What have you done for this family, Emily? And why are you acting like it's some big secrets?" She glared at me, her cheeks flushing with anger again. "Why can't you just drop it?" she snapped. "You always have to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." "Maybe if you stopped lying for 2 seconds, I wouldn't have to," I shot back. "That's enough," Dad said, his voice sharp. He turned to Emily, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Emily, if there's something going on, just tell us. We're family. We can figure it out together." For a moment, I thought she might break. Her shoulders slumped, and her eyes filled with tears. But then she shook her head again, straightening up as if she'd made a decision. "There's nothing to tell," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "I was just venting. Can we please move on?" But no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of her words still hung in the air, and it was clear that no one was ready to let it go. "Emily," I said again, softer this time, "we just want to help. Whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone." Her eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, and I saw a flash of something. Fear? Guilt? Pain? But just as quickly, she looked away. "It's not the right time," she muttered, sinking back onto the couch. "Then when is the right time?" I asked. But she didn't answer. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally, Mom stood up and announced that she was making tea. It was her go-to move when things got too intense, a way to give everyone a moment to breathe. As she bustled off to the kitchen, the room slowly began to come back to life. The kids resumed their game, and the adults started murmuring quietly to each other. But the tension lingered, thick and unspoken. I sat down on the armrest of a chair, watching Emily out of the corner of my eye. She was staring at her phone again, her fingers moving absently across the screen. Whatever secret she was keeping, it was eating her alive, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered it. For now, though, I had to let it rest. Emily had slipped, but she hadn't fully cracked. And if I wanted to get to the truth, I'd have to find a way to push her without driving her further into hiding. One way or another, I was going to get my answers. It was just a matter of time. The living room was thick with tension, every breath measured, and every movement hesitant, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Emily sat on the couch, her phone forgotten beside her. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling slightly, and it was clear she was teetering on the edge of something. It felt like the entire family was suspended in this fragile moment, waiting for her next words to shatter the silence. Finally, she broke. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't want to tell anyone," she began, her words spilling out in a rush, "but I've been struggling. I made some bad decisions, and I've been borrowing money from Mom and Dad to cover it up." The room erupted into chaos. My dad leaned forward in his chair, his face a mix of shock and confusion. "What do you mean, borrowing money? For what?" My mom sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My siblings started whispering to each other, their voices hushed but urgent. Even the kids seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their games forgotten as they stared at the adults with wide eyes. I just stood there, trying to process what Emily had said. Of all the things I had imagined, this wasn't even on my radar. Emily had always seemed so perfect, so put together. The golden child, who could do no wrong. I never would have guessed she was hiding something like this. "It started a couple of years ago," Emily continued, her voice trembling. "I got in over my head with credit cards. Then there was the loan I took out to pay off some of the debt, but it just made things worse." Her tears flowed freely now, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't know what else to do. Mom and Dad were the only ones I could turn to. "Emily," Dad said, his voice tight, "how much money are we talking about?" She hesitated, glancing up at him through tear-soaked lashes. "About 30,000, she admitted quietly. The collective gasp from the room was almost deafening. 30,000? I blurted out before I could stop myself. "Emily, what were you even spending it on?" She flinched at my words, her eyes darting to me with a mix of guilt and anger. "I didn't want you to know because I knew you'd judge me," she said, her voice rising. You've always acted like you're better than me, like you've got everything figured out while I'm just a mess. Her accusation hit me like a slap. That's not true, I said defensively. I just wanted to understand why you've been acting so weird. I wasn't trying to judge you. Well, congratulations, she snapped. Now everyone knows, and you can all talk about how I'm not as perfect as you thought I was. Mom finally spoke, her voice shaky but firm. Emily, we never thought you were perfect, she said, reaching out to place a hand on Emily's knee. But we do love you, and we would have helped you no matter what. You didn't have to go through this alone. Emily let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because it sure feels like everyone's ready to pile on me right now. No one's piling on you, Dad said, though his tone suggested he was still grappling with his own frustration. We just want to understand what happened so we can help you fix it. Emily shook her head, her tears slowing but her expression still guarded.
It's not that simple, she said.
I've been trying to fix it on my own, but every time I think I'm getting ahead, something else comes up, and I'm back to square one. I sat down on the armrest of a nearby chair, my anger softening into something closer to pity. Emily, why didn't you just tell us sooner? I asked. Why let it get this bad? Because I was embarrassed, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you to see me like this. You've always been the one who could just get through things. You don't need help. I do. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in the image she'd worked so hard to project. Emily wasn't the flawless golden child I'd always resented her for being. She was human, just like me, struggling to hold it all together. The realization was both jarring and oddly comforting. For the next hour, the conversation shifted from accusations to solutions. Dad promised to help Emily figure out a repayment plan, while Mom insisted on getting her in touch with a financial advisor. My siblings chimed in with their own suggestions, and even I found myself offering to help where I could. It wasn't easy. There were still a lot of hard feelings simmering beneath the surface, but for the first time in years, it felt like we were all on the same side. By the end of the night, Emily looked exhausted but relieved. As we started to clean up and head to bed, she pulled me aside.
Thank you, she said quietly, for pushing me to say something.
I hated it, but I think I needed it. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The truth had finally come out, but the road ahead was still long and uncertain. All I knew was that, for better or worse, we were in it together now. The days following Emily's confession were anything but calm. The family gathering, which was supposed to be a time of togetherness, had turned into a whirlwind of debates, whispers, and lingering tension. No one could agree on how to process what had happened, and the fault lines between us grew sharper with each passing day. Some family members, particularly Mom and a few of the aunts, thought I had crossed a line by calling Emily out in front of everyone. It wasn't the time or place, Mom said during a strange phone call a few days later. You could have pulled her aside and talked to her privately. On the other side of the argument were my siblings, who felt that Emily needed to face the consequences of her actions. She's been acting like she's untouchable for years, Alex said. It's about time someone called her out. And then there was me, stuck somewhere in the middle, drowning in a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort through. At first, all I felt was guilt. I hadn't planned to humiliate Emily. I'd pushed her to confess because I was tired of the lies, the secrecy, and the tension that had been hanging over the family like a storm cloud. But as I replayed the confrontation in my head, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd gone too far. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe I should have pulled Emily aside and given her the chance to explain herself in private. Instead, I'd put her on the spot in front of everyone, forcing her to spill her deepest secrets with an audience. But then the guilt would give way to anger. Emily had been lying for years, covering up her mistakes while pretending to have it all together. She let me believe she was perfect while I struggled with my own insecurities, never realizing that the golden child I resented was hiding cracks in her own foundation. And then, of course, there was the confusion. What did this mean for our relationship moving forward? Could I forgive her for the lies, and could she forgive me for dragging her secret into the light? For the first few days, Emily avoided me entirely. She didn't respond to my texts, and whenever I called, the line went straight to voicemail. At first, I told myself to give her space. She needed time to process everything, and maybe I did too. But as the silence stretched on, I started to worry that I'd done irreparable damage to our already fragile relationship. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Emily. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a moment, my stomach churning with equal parts relief and anxiety. I typed back quickly, of course.
When?
We ended up meeting at a small cafe near her apartment. She looked different, more tired, less polished, like the weight of the past few days had finally caught up with her. "Thanks for coming," she said, stirring her tea absently. "Thanks for reaching out," I replied. "I wasn't sure if you wanted to talk to me after everything." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "I didn't," she admitted. "But then I realized I owe you an apology." I blinked, taken aback. "An apology?" "For how I've acted," she said, looking down at her tea. "Not just at the gathering, but for years, really. I know I've been difficult, and I know I've made you feel like I was better than you. But the truth is, I've been trying so hard to hold it all together that I didn't even see how much damage I was doing." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Emily," I said carefully, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how else to get through to you." She nodded, her eyes glassy, with unshed tears. "I know. And I needed that push, even if I hated it at the time. You were right, I couldn't keep hiding from this. But it's going to take me a while to fix everything." The conversation wasn't easy. Emily was still defensive at times, and I found myself slipping back into old patterns of frustration. But for the first time in years, we were talking, really talking, and it felt like a step in the right direction. As we left the cafe, she hesitated for a moment, then pulled me into an awkward hug. "Thanks," she said softly, "for not giving up on me." I patted her back, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, hope, and the faintest flicker of something like forgiveness. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Emily had a lot of work to do, and so did I. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we might actually get somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, it was strange to see how the fallout of Emily's confession shifted the dynamics in our family. At first, there were cracks, awkward silences during calls, lingering tension between Emily and some of our siblings, and quiet resentment from Mom, who wasn't thrilled with how everything had come to light. But something surprising happened over time. The initial discomfort began to fade, replaced by tentative steps toward healing. It was as if the confrontation had shaken something loose, forcing all of us to confront not just Emily's struggles, but the way we'd let unspoken tensions and old grudges fester over the years. For Emily, it was like a dam had broken. After years of projecting an image of perfection, she finally allowed herself to be vulnerable, to admit that she didn't have everything under control. It wasn't easy for her. There were still moments when her pride got in the way, but she was trying. And that effort made all the difference. One night, during one of our family group calls, Emily opened up about the full scope of her financial struggles. She told us about the sleepless nights she'd spent worrying about her mounting debt, the anxiety that gnawed at her every time a new bill arrived, and the shame she felt for needing help. "I kept telling myself I'd fix it on my own," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "That if I just worked harder or saved more, I could make it all go away. But it just kept getting worse. And the worse it got, the harder it was to tell anyone." Her honesty was raw and uncomfortable, but it was also the most real I'd ever seen her. Mom and Dad reassured her that they were there for her, offering to help her create a budget and connect with a financial advisor. Alex, who had been so angry during the initial fallout, even joked about how her newfound budgeting skills might come in handy for family vacations. As for me, I realized that my own role in the family dynamic wasn't as straightforward as I'd thought. For years, I'd carried around a deep resentment toward Emily, resentment for being the golden child, for always seeming to have it together while I struggled to find my footing. But now, I saw her in a different light. She wasn't perfect, and she never had been. She was human, just like the rest of us, and she was doing her best to navigate the messiness of life. The image of her I'd been holding on to, the untouchable, flawless older sister, was just that, an image. Letting go of that resentment wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. I started to think about my own role in our relationship. How many times had I assumed the worst of her, or let my own insecurities color the way I saw her? How often had I contributed to the distance between us without even realizing it? One night, during a quiet conversation over coffee, I told her as much. "I think I've been holding on to this idea of who you are," I said, staring into my mug. "And I think it's made me blind to who you really are. I'm sorry for that." She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise. "I never thought you'd say something like that," she said with a soft laugh. "Well, don't get used to it," I teased. "But seriously, I know I've been hard on you, and I want to do better. I think we both could." Her smile was small but genuine. "I'd like that,"
she said.
Our relationship isn't perfect now, and I don't think it ever will be. But it's better. For the first time in a long time, it feels like we're actually seeing each other for who we are, flaws and all. As a family, we've grown closer in unexpected ways. We still argue, of course. What family doesn't? But there's an openness now that wasn't there before. We talk more, share more, and, most importantly, listen more. I've learned that the truth, while painful, is almost always better than living in the dark. It's messy and uncomfortable, but it's also what allows us to grow. In the end, the confrontation that I thought would tear us apart ended up being the thing that brought us back together. We're not perfect, far from it. But we're trying. And for now, that's enough.